Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz.
Hello and welcome to episode 80 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the living room of James Tyrone's summer home in New London, Connecticut, on a morning in August 1912. James and his wife Mary have just finished their breakfast. James is 65 years of age, an actor who has enjoyed a commercially successful career touring the country in a perennially popular play. This house in New London is what passes for the Tyrone family's home each summer. Mary is a decade younger than her husband, and a strikingly pretty woman with a pale face, white hair, and unusually beautiful dark eyes. Although graceful in posture and fastidiously dressed, her fluttering hands betray a nervousness that she is struggling to disguise. A nervousness that partly stems from worry about her two grown-up sons, and particularly for the youngest, Edmund, who displays ominous symptoms of serious ill health. Both boys also seem to be marooned in unemployment, an idle state which provokes their father's disapproval. The men are also nervous, however, for they are concerned for Mary's health and are all watching her too closely for signs of a possible relapse. These are the febrile circumstances that prompt the Tyrone family to a torturous and tragic self-examination as the summer's day turns into a long day's journey into night. Eugene O'Neill's autobiographical magnum opus is a relentlessly bitter and mournful round-robin of recriminations and self-dramatization, written as an act of personal confrontation with his own family demons. As the title suggests, the play is long and taxing. It is raw and despairing, but also lyrical and ultimately heartbreakingly moving. Eugene O'Neill finished writing Long Day's Journey into Night in April 1941, but because of the personal revelations it contained, he gave explicit instructions that the play was not to be published until 25 years after his death, and more extraordinarily, that it should never be performed on stage. However, within 3 years of his death, his widow allowed both the publication of the play and the first productions at the Royal Dramatic Theatre in Stockholm and then on Broadway, where it received ecstatic reviews and won the 4th Pulitzer Prize of O'Neill's career. It has been staged many times since, filmed on a number of occasions, and become a staple of educational curricula, particularly in North America. As we record this episode, a powerful new production is playing in the West End of London, with Brian Cox, most recently renowned as the ruthless patriarch Logan Roy in the TV series Succession, and Patricia Clarkson leading the cast. I'm very excited and privileged to be able to talk today to the production's director, Jeremy Herrin, about this monumental play. Welcome to the Play Podcast, Jeremy. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much, Douglas. It's an honor to be here talking about this magnificent play. And what a fantastic summary you gave of it there. Really, really great.
Thank you. Before we get stuck in, I must just do a brief introduction to you. Jeremy has been a director of Live Theatre Newcastle, the Royal Court, and Headlong Theatre Companies. Highlights of his distinguished career include directing Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies for the RSC, with transfers to London and New York, James Graham's plays This House, Labour of Love, and Best of Enemies, the last of which I was fortunate enough to talk with James about in episode 39 of the podcast. Jeremy also directed the original production of Duncan Macmillan's People, Places, and Things at the National Theatre in the West End and New York. And as we speak, he's in the midst of rehearsals for a revival of the play, which opens shortly at the Trafalgar Theatre in London. I'm very much looking forward to seeing that, and I'm hugely grateful once again, Jeremy, for taking time out from your busy schedule to join me here. Now, I said at the top, Long Day's Journey into Night is a daunting work. At least I was certainly somewhat daunted coming to it for this conversation, in the way that I was, I think, with King Lear, for example. So I have two connected questions to start with. First, what drew you to take on this heavyweight play? And then, why should audiences put themselves through 3 hours plus of the Tyrone's miserable infighting and despair?
What a great question. I mean, that is the question. I suppose both of those things provide the answer. There's something of a kind of great peak of dramatic literature that this play represents. And you've got to be in the mood to tackle it. You've got to have a sense of match fitness. You've got to have the right companions on that potentially arduous journey. But I think if you get hold of the play and you do what O'Neill wanted you to do, then you can make what is quite a daunting prospect for its audience a deeply rewarding one, and an experience that at its best is up there and actually competes with the sort of plays that you mentioned, like a King Lear, like Chekhov at his finest. It really is one of the great peaks of dramatic literature. And I suppose as a director, it's something that you want to test yourself against. Can you keep an audience wrapped and engaged? Because the play is fantastic, but you've got to get it right, because it's long and it's easy to disengage from. I believe the audiences, generally speaking, if they can disengage from work, they will, particularly when it's as harrowing and as emotionally excavating as O'Neill generally, but Long Day's Journey in particular. So you've got to be good, and you've got to find a good reason to keep them engaged. It's a fun test, and I enjoyed doing it. And I can't say whether I've been successful or not. Probably partially successful.
Well, oh, no. Well, it's interesting that you say that you've got to be up to your game and do it well, because my wife, who saw it with me, who didn't know the play, and she said, boy, in the wrong hands, that could be terrible. But she was absorbed. So I think that's testament to both the points you make about how challenging it can be. And it is a bit of a marathon, and it may be a question of taste. I absolutely love it because it's also very literary, and I appreciate that, certainly. But we'll talk quite a lot about why we find it so powerful. I wanted to actually start with asking a bit about Eugene O'Neill himself. I'm not sure how much people know about him here in the UK. He's certainly big on the drama agenda and education in North America. But where did this play fit into his life? And also, I said as well that it's very autobiographical, that there's a lot of source material in his own life. And I'm interested in what those elements are in the play.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I'm the sort of person that researches a play thoroughly, and then as soon as it opens, moves on to the next one. I feel like I used to know a lot about Eugene O'Neill, and I used to know a lot about Long Day's Journey and Tonight. But yeah, it was really good to research it, because I've been lucky enough to work on a few new plays and adaptations of writers that are around and still alive, and who've, graced the rehearsal rooms by being there. And quite early in my career at the Royal Court, I learned a bit of a trick, which was, if you want to understand how the dialogue should play and what sort of rhythm, what sort of tempo, then listen to the writer. Because writers, to some degree, are writing versions of themselves. They're embodying those characters. And more often than not, when the writers are creating their works, they're often speaking the language out loud. It's that famous story about Arthur Miller building a little shed on his property in Vermont or Connecticut or wherever it was, and doing all the voices and speaking his way through it.
So what did you do to listen to Eugene O'Neill?
Well, amazingly enough, I found some live recording of him speaking some of the lines from Long Day's Journey.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he does a little bit of the speech from Act 4, where Edmund talks about Mary moving around upstairs. And he does it in this sort of quite reserved, quite sort of stentorian tone that's really worth tracking down. It's on the internet, I think via Yale University. I found it on SoundCloud. And it was really exciting to hear his voice.
So what did you learn from that?
I learned that he speaks almost exactly as Brian Cox interprets the role of James Tyrone. What was brilliant and what was fantastic, and all of us in the room learned from him, particularly the younger actors, that he plays through with the punctuation. He plays through to the full stop. And as you know, O'Neill has lots of clauses and sub-clauses. Those ideas pile up. And if you stop for too much emphasis on a particular bit that you're interested in, then you lose the sense of the whole. And actually, Shakespeare is quoted a lot in the play and referred to a lot in the play. And in terms of, the kind of performance of a rhetorical, poetic drama, it's not dissimilar. It needs the same sort of skill set because those sentences are lengthy and they need a lot of breath control, and you need to be judicious about where you emphasize it. So, that's what hearing him told me, was that he trusted the language. And I suppose that was a bit of a watchword for the production, was to really boil the production right back down and trust what O'Neill was up to.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's really interesting you talk about that because, as I said at the top, he intended that the play not be actually performed. And I was going to ask you actually at some point how you thought that affects what he's written, because it is quite literary in a way. And the text, for example, is full of extensive stage direction, initially describing the house, the characters, and it has directions on line readings, even interpretations of what people are saying, in the way that he thinks, well, if it's only going to be read, then like a novelist, I will paint a picture for them, a fuller picture. But then you're talking about the rhythms of speech, of course, which if he was going to write a novel, why didn't he write a novel? He wrote a play, right?
I mean, the play, that was his form. And we started the question about where it was in his writing life. And as far as I'm aware, I think it was his penultimate play. Does your research confirm that?
Yes. Was it just Moon for Misbegotten thereafter, possibly? But it's late in his life. You're right.
Yeah, I think that was the last one. Because he'd just been writing More Stately Mansions, which he abandoned. And it felt like, from reading his diaries and some of those journals and letters and so on, you get the sense that he had this burden that he needed to put down. And that was the story of his family. And it's an incredible play. I remember when I first read it, I thought it was an amazing fictional construct that said so much about early 20th century. And it was only after having read it and looking into it a bit more that I realized that there is a kind of autobiographical progeny for almost every beat in it. It's fascinating that he just didn't want anyone to see it, certainly not whilst he was still alive and whilst members of his family were still alive.
It's so personal, isn't it?
It's so personal. I don't think he would have been able to write it. I think I said somewhere quite glibly, that he would have written the play in a completely different way if he'd been going into rehearsal 2 weeks on Monday. He just would have obscured some of the characters. He would have amalgamated certain moments. I mean, the thing that he has constructed is the time structure, which is the play's structural genius, in that it means he can pull back on plot in the traditional sense and favour story. And by story, I mean the reveal of what's happened between the characters in the past. So, on some level, you could look at the play's structure and it could feel almost willfully naive somehow, in the sense that it's closed place. It's all in the living room of the Tyrone's house in New London, Connecticut, which was a real house that James Tyrone bought with some of the proceeds from the famous novel that he adapted, and was a creative millstone around his neck. And what O'Neill has done is that he's compressed a lot of family events and relationships into the period starting at 8:30 in the morning, ending in the middle of the night, and given it 4 acts, 2 scenes in the second act, before and after lunch. And it just plays itself out without a lot of new events, but a lot of reveals. So you never feel like, when you're working on it, oh, he's just saying that because, which you often feel. I go, okay, that's the reason why we're saying that, is we're setting this idea up, or there's an event that needs to happen. And actually, the kind of dramaturgical transactions are pretty simple. What they're talking about is as complex and contradictory as real life. Those characters are lovable and despicable in equal measure, in the way that only a member of a family can properly understand. And it's a family kind of turbocharged. It's family dysfunction times 100. So yeah, it's a magnificently pure, very confident, very private piece of work. And I think had it been rushing into rehearsal, I think it would have been very different. And I think it would have been much shorter.
Yes, as you say, I think it's almost like a private exorcism of his own, isn't it? By the time he wrote it in 1941, he'd been writing plays for nearly 30 years, had won worldwide recognition, 3 Pulitzer Prizes, the Nobel Prize for Literature. And in this late phase of his career, he turned to writing something much more personal, epic in some ways. The Iceman Cometh just preceded this, and Long Day's Journey, and very deeply personal, as we've said, not intended even necessarily to be seen at all. And it's so autobiographical, but distilled, events of his own life, distilled, as you say, and intensified within this one-day period. And I agree entirely also, you don't get clunky exposition, but you do get discovery of what has happened in these lives previously and why therefore these characters are the way they are now and behaving the way they are to each other. And there's a sense of a continuum of their lives preceding this day and then stretching into the future as well to some degree. And then some of those autobiographical facts. I mean, as you mentioned, his father was an actor, as James Tyrone Sr. in the play is an actor, toured with a theatrical company most of his life, performing a single show that he had the rights to, as you mentioned, The Count of Monte Cristo. And his mother traveled with him. His father suffered from alcoholism. His mother did actually suffer from an addiction to morphine, which, as we'll discover, the mother in the play does, Mary. When Eugene was 14, his mother attempted to throw herself into the river across from this house in New London, which, again, an event referred to in the play. Edmund in the play is, I guess, in a sense, Eugene himself, isn't he?
Yeah, and that's really interesting. That's one of the things that still is a mystery to me, is why. So there's 2 sons in the play, but between Jamie and Edmund, the characters that we know, there was another son that died. And in real life, that character was called Edmund. And Eugene O'Neill was the youngest son. But in the play, the dead baby is called Eugene. And the living character that is obviously gearing up to be potentially a great writer, I mean, you can see his future laid ahead of him, is called Edmund. There's something darkly mysterious and articulate about Eugene O'Neill giving himself his dead brother's name that feels totally in keeping with the psychic world of the play.
Yes, it is a strange exchange that I hadn't really got to the bottom of why that is, but it's clearly deliberate. His older brother, Jamie, who's Jamie in the play, was also an actor, as he is in the play, and an alcoholic who eventually drank himself to death. And O'Neill's own adult life was not without its traumas. He married 3 times, had 3 children. His 2 sons, Eugene Jr. and Shane, suffered from alcoholism and addictions, and both committed suicide, in fact. And famously, his daughter, Una, married Charlie Chaplin when she was 18, and Chaplin was 57 or something. And O'Neill disowned her and never saw her again. And then just after this, I think he was entering into this phase in 1940s when he wrote this play, when he started to suffer from a Parkinson-like tremor in his hands that made it impossible for him to write during the last 10 years of his life. So I think you're right that these are the last plays that he actually wrote. And his wife reported that this was an emotionally painful process for him. As we said, deeply personal. And there's a quote I read, which she said that when he started writing Long Day's Journey into Night, it was a most strange experience to watch, that man being tortured every day by his own writing. He would come out of his study at the end of the day, gaunt and sometimes weeping. So he was reliving traumas of his own life in writing it.
Yeah, I mean, the dedication for Carlotta on our 12th wedding anniversary, dearest, I give you the original script of this play of old sorrow written in tears and blood. You know, that's where we start.
Yeah, and so it is. I was going to say that we could give a brief plot summary, but actually what's funny about this, and I think you touched on this earlier, is that it's not really a conventional plot, is there? In fact, again, quoting my wife, she said to me, not a lot actually happens, does it? And in some ways that's true, in some ways it isn't true. We do discover a lot.
Not a lot happens, but a lot has happened.
Yes, and this is a family torn by so much that has happened. And we see cycles of recrimination and punishment, forgiveness, excuses, pain, anger, all the rest. And it all comes from the characters, the mix of who they are, where they've been, and how they rub up against each other as a family. You said at the beginning they're complicated. They are both good and bad, aren't they, these characters? On the surface, occasionally you might think, oh my God, he's being horrible. But they're not, any of them, solely that. Let's start with James Tyrone Sr., who on the surface seems to be the dominant central character of the play, Jeremy. He's the forceful patriarch, constantly exerting his views. He's a bit of a curmudgeon, isn't he? But he's also, of course, an actor.
Yeah.
So he's used to having center stage, and he behaves a bit like a star actor.
He does. He's an anxious man. He was born into poverty. He carries the burden of his immigrant status. His fear of the poorhouse is referred to a number of times. The suspected suicide of his father, who left the family in America and went back to Ireland to die. His mother, who brought them up single-handedly, who's described as a kind, sweet woman. And he worked in a machine shop making files from the age of 10 because he was the breadwinner. And then from there, he studied Shakespeare, loved it, took on walk-on parts, and then became one of the most successful actors in America, and then got the rights to the Count of Monte Cristo and made a fortune, but lost his sense of himself as an artist because he was netting $35,000 to $40,000 net profit a season.
But he just kept doing it because it was so profitable, right?
Yeah, and he couldn't get off that bus because of, I suppose, the trauma of his impoverished childhood. And Brian Cox himself has been on record talking about his past and his relationship with money. So keen listeners might want to see on the internet the very moving cross-fertilization between Brian and James Tyrone. So he is like that, but we find that out slowly. His sons have him down as a miser. And it's only later in the play that we realize where his miserliness comes from, which means that we end up having wells of sympathy activated by the time we hear his story in Act 4.
We do, though it is hard to watch the stinginess as well. It's a paradox, isn't it? Because you credit, as you say, why he feels this way, where he's come from. And he rages against his sons who've had everything and seem to be lacking in ambition and achievement as far as he's concerned. And this galls him. But this stinginess is something, there's a great line he says somewhere that he can't unlearn. It's just in him now.
Yeah.
But it has terrible consequences because he's accused of, and I think we think this is the truth, that he chooses doctors for Mary, his wife, and his son Edmund on the basis that they're the cheapest option, and therefore jeopardizing their potential recoveries or health. Is that not right?
We just don't know whether that's true. He puts up a muscular defense, that he talked to the hotel proprietor. He was offered the best person. He never admits that that's a problem. And he says that he spent thousands upon thousands trying to help her find a cure. So I think it feels like it's left as an easy accusation, but not necessarily the whole story. So I think O'Neill complicates our response to him intentionally, that we can't just dismiss him as a miser because nobody's that simple.
No, but it's a very tough balance to strike because I think the boys certainly and Mary, they all accuse him. And, the way he both denies and justifies his prudence, that's a classic defense.
I mean, O'Neill keeps it open. O'Neill has one when Edmund's accusing him of that. He pushes back. And then he says, instead of spending on the most expensive sanatorium for me, you got a cheaper one. And then you went and bought some property. And O'Neill in the stage direction says Tyrone is lying feebly. So that's the only moment where the author is saying he's lying.
He did compromise there.
Yeah, he tries to get away with that. So that there is a clue in there. But I don't think it's definitive.
No, but you have that almost comic moment when they come back in the evening and turn the lights on, and he is cross because he doesn't want all the lights on. That's a waste of money. And he's literally standing on the table, unscrewing the light bulbs.
Yeah.
It's a pretty graphic image of this stinginess that he can't unlearn. It's definitely real.
Yeah, it's real. He is definitely a penny pincher for sure. But I suppose what I mean is I think Eugene O'Neill makes us understand why.
What about the rage? He seems to be angry a lot of the time. Where do you think that comes from? At his sons? At any provocation?
Well, why are any of us angry? And with our families, we're often angry because we're seeing reflections of ourselves, or we're projecting ourselves onto our children, or we're sublimating unsaid agendas with our partners and our wives and our husbands. I mean, that's how families work, isn't it? They're not slick, clean psychological machines. And these people had a lot of trouble to carry around. And also, they're lying to each other. They think they're lying to each other to protect themselves, but it's just making things more complicated. And I suppose, one of the things that happens in the play is that with Mary, when she starts using again, she's nipping upstairs to inject herself with morphine, that she just becomes disinhibited and she starts talking about all the difficult things in the past. And that has a knock-on effect with everybody else, where everybody else is discombobulated and people start expressing themselves and pushing each other around. And by the time we hit the middle of the night, there's nowhere to turn.
Yeah. There's not much holding back. It reminds me of, I've said this many times, and I hope I'm not misquoting, but I believe it was James Joyce said, all anger is anger with oneself. And if it's not universally true, it's certainly some truth in it. And, there's anger that we find ourselves in predicaments we don't want to be in, and we may blame others, but he feels helpless perhaps in not being able to help Mary, or he's helpless and frustrated about his sons and doesn't understand them. And you touched earlier about the failure of his talent as he saw it, and he sold out. And that niggles at him, I'm sure, that some part of his self-worth is questioned.
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty sure that James Sr. sees James Jr., Jamie, as a reflection of his failure. And he wants Edmund to be a reflection of his success, that everybody's invested in the youngest child to turn it round and be successful. They all talk about what's going to happen to Edmund, but poor Jamie is scapegoated.
Yeah. It's interesting watching the performance of Brian Cox and reading the play again. There is both the bad and the good. There are times where it's quite hard to like James Sr. But what's interesting is I thought that there's what I call an ameliorating softness is his love for Mary, because that's genuine, isn't it?
I feel so. And if there is anything that the production has committed to, it's that idea that for there to be that level of dysfunction, there has to be love. And their frustration, their anger is about that love not connecting properly, that love not functioning. But that love is there. And you can see that the way Patricia and Brian play it, that they're invested in that completely. And it struck me really profoundly that it would be more heartbreaking the more love is underneath it.
Quite right. And it's in the text too. Kathleen, the servant girl, says, any fool can see he worships the ground you walk on. And at one point, she says, I know you still love me, James, in spite of everything. Yes, as God is my judge, always and forever, Mary. And I love you, dear, in spite of everything. So I think you're absolutely right. The more that's there, the more heartbreaking it is.
Those two lines, by the way, get big laughs. When she goes in spite of everything, we get it. It's actually a very funny play. There are lots of moments of sort of bitter, dark levity in there that I'm sure O'Neill put in to leaven the whole experience.
Yeah, like where James Tyrone's insistent that Shakespeare was Irish.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Mary. In your production in particular, I was struck, in fact, by how much I think Mary is really the center of the play. For all Tyrone's bluster and egotism, it's Mary who's the central figure in the family, who they're all emotionally tied to, revolve around. It's a fantastic part, isn't it?
It really is. It's a very challenging part as well. Technically, it's very difficult. Those are the kind of things that it's so easy to mess up, drinking and drug taking. Poor Mary is addicted to morphine, and you want to show the inebriation, you want to show the dissociation, but in a real and truthful way. And Patricia Clarkson has done a really excellent job of that.
She's exquisite. She captures the beauty, the charm, the girlish innocence that's overlaid by all this unhappiness, and her fragility fighting for her peace or equilibrium. It's an extraordinary portrait of human fallibility and tragedy. And what's really hard is her own denial. She's defiant, but also deluded. She keeps denying to the others that anything's happening. And that's so painful to watch.
She's an addict. Defiance is a classic characteristic of the addict. And I love those bits where she's in denial.
There's a beautiful detail about her worrying about her hair.
Yeah.
As the men are watching her very closely, she thinks that the reason they're looking at her is perhaps because her hair has come undone in some way. And she says repeatedly, "Is my hair coming down?" It's a deflection, of course, but it's also poignant because she is really worried that her appearance is giving her away. And also her appearance is important because it's a signal that she's able to maintain her composure, her civilized appearance. I just love that detail.
And we have some fun with that in the production because we flip it so that what happens with her hair is the signifier of her using.
Yes.
So that by the time she comes down at the end, it's the first time that you've seen her hair completely down. She's there, like unstructured, unpicked.
So tell me, I suppose, this question about, I don't know, how culpable, but the men seem to have some idea that it's just a question of willpower. It certainly wasn't her fault that she was prescribed the morphine after the birth of Edmund and became addicted. But, she's not had an easy time of it either. I mean, she complains a lot about what she's had to put up with. So in some ways, is it a conscious escape from what she's had to live with James on the road? She complains a lot about them failing to make a home for her and the family.
She's got plenty to complain about. And yeah, she's addicted, arguably through no fault of her own. She was administered morphine. And it was very common for middle-class women at that time that they were given morphine and they became addicted.
Let me ask you about what's fascinating is, of course, as she takes more and becomes more detached, she also starts to disappear into the past when she was happiest. This is where she escapes to. When she first met James and fell in love, when she's at schoolgirl at the convent, she had some idea she was going to be a concert pianist. But the more that she takes, the further into the past and detached from the present she becomes.
Yeah, that's what she does. And they know the routine. And by the end of the play, she's back before she met James, where her life was ahead of her. And, everybody knows the devastating final line where she forgets that something happened to her. And then she references meeting James. It's a wonderful bit of playwriting that we've come full circle to that moment where she almost forgets meeting her husband and then remembers right at the end.
Yeah, because what she's remembering back to is also tied up with Catholic faith, isn't it?
Yeah. And interestingly, O'Neill's mother, Ella, who was a morphine addict, tried various cures, various sanatoriums, various doctors, trying to resist temptation, trying to use willpower, could never crack it. But she did shift her addiction when she rediscovered her faith. So at the point of writing, O'Neill knew that that's how his mother eventually beat her addiction. So he has her skating around that, searching for that cure and mentioning it sometimes obliquely, sometimes very directly. But that's him signposting what the eventual cure would be.
That's amazing, yes, because she does say several times if she could only return to her faith, then the Virgin Mary would protect her. Somehow then it would be easy, she says. And she so regrets that she's lost it, or that she believes the Virgin Mary's given up on her too, perhaps, because she has left the convent, of course, because she fell for James and chose that over becoming a nun. And she feels guilty also about the death of Eugene because she had left him with her mother while she was on the road with James and he contracted measles.
Because he'd insisted, that's right.
Yeah, so she feels guilt for that. So she somehow feels unworthy of the faith. But she does hold out that if she could return to that, the lost innocence of her childhood when she did have the faith, then that would solve it even.
Yeah.
The rest of them, I don't think, have that faith, do they?
Well, James Tyrone says that he does, that he doesn't go to church, but he believes. And his sons are both atheists.
Yes, well, he says he's prayed, but it doesn't seem to be working.
He prays every morning and night.
And the sons think what's happened to her and their lives, no beneficent God would allow.
Yeah, well, there's a lovely moment where Edmund says, "And did you pray for Mama?" And he says something like, "Yes, I did every morning and night. I was on my knees to pray." And then Edmund says, "Well, Nietzsche must be right. God is dead. For his pity for man hath God died."
Where is he?
Yeah, exactly. Because there's a battle in the play between the literature that James likes and the literature that Edmund likes.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a wonderful scene as the night wears on the boys and James come back from town having drunk a skinful, and some home truths are spoken to each other. Firstly, with James and Edmund. And it's a very literary scene, as you say. James is often quoting Shakespeare, and then there's that bravura speech where Edmund precisely quotes a poem by Baudelaire and some others. And it's just exhilarating. The poetry's fantastic.
Yeah.
But it's also a bit of him showcasing himself as the writer, but also that he's at least the equal of his father's literary knowledge, and perhaps even more progressive, I think, as you suggest, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, his father just wants him to go to Shakespeare. I have 3 good sets of Shakespeare here.
Yeah.
Edmund talks about having learned the part of Macbeth for a bet. Really, he's more interested in Baudelaire, in Swinburne, in his own poetry.
Well, yeah, and he discounts his own poetry. He doesn't seem to think it's worth anything. But, it's a giveaway, isn't there? There's this fantastic poetic speech where he talks about the time he spent at sea when he's on the ship lying on the bowsprit and the ship is racing through the waves, or in the dawn, he's up in the crow's nest at the top in the quiet sea. And it's just beautifully written.
Yeah, wonderful. Magnificent dramatic writing.
I mean, he's obviously the writer. What about Jamie? You touched on him at the beginning.
Jamie's the character that tugs my heartstrings the most. I feel so bad for Jamie.
Why?
He's such a good guy.
He's a good guy behaving badly.
Yeah.
Why is he behaving badly?
I mean, he's been characterized so negatively by everybody. I mean, his mum blames him for the dead baby's death, saying that Jamie made it happen.
Yeah, that's right.
His father, thinks he's a loser and a waster. He hates himself. It's been successfully projected onto him. The way Daryl McCormack is playing it is really touching. And I always feel awful for Jamie, particularly because he's the one that cares the most about Mary and about her plight, and is sympathetic to what she's going through, and is the most realistic about addiction because he's seen it in the prostitutes that he frequents.
I think he also knows it about himself.
Well, he acknowledges his own addiction as a drinker, I suppose.
Yeah, he is self-destructive, clearly. And as you say, it's projected on him, I suppose. And there's this mix of this cynicism, but also we admire the fact that he will speak the truth at times when it's very unpalatable and perhaps even cruel, but he can't abide the dissembling.
Yeah, but also, it's defensive. His cynicism is defensive. If you're given that role in a family, you're safe if you're negative because no one can hurt you, no one can get you. But it means that he's cut out. And there's that heartbreaking bit where Jamie is drunk enough to warn his brother that he doesn't always have his best interests at heart. He quotes, "Greater love
hath no man than this, that he saveth his brother from himself."
Yeah.
It's fantastic. That's an amazing scene. You're right. It's an extraordinary confession of his jealousy of Edmund. He warns him against himself. And he says he wants Edmund to fail because otherwise he'll look even worse.
Yeah.
There's a psychological truth in there, complicated, but he loves his brother to death as well.
Yeah.
As he does his mother. As you said, there's a soft heart in him. He's truly gutted by his mother's relapse. And that's one of the things through the play that's also heartbreaking, is they talk about they had hope. All of the men had hope that this time she may have been beating it. And it's the hope that kills you, of course. And it's also self-reflective, I suppose. He says, "I suppose it's because I feel so damn sunk," he says at one point, "because this time Mama had me fooled. I really believed she had it licked. She thinks I always believe the worst, but this time I believe the best. I suppose I can't forgive her yet." I love that "yet," he might. "It meant so much. I'd begun to hope. If she's beaten the game, I could too." Yeah, I see why you feel for him.
Yeah, poor old Jamie. And you know what happened to him? As you just said, he died young, an alcoholic. He couldn't shake it. He had some talent as a writer. He was a very good student. At the time of his mother's addiction, his life fell apart.
I don't think you think he's going to beat it, do you?
No, you just don't.
No. Whereas Edmund, I'm interested in what you think about that. In some ways, he feels a bit disconnected from the others. He went to sea. The fact that he writes, maybe it's that he has his inner life. I don't know whether it's just projection of the fact that we know O'Neill carries on and is a successful writer.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there's a chance he will get away and do something for himself?
Yeah. The big threat in the play is his illness.
Yes, if he lives. Yes.
Yeah, as he says, yeah, if I live. So we don't know. That's the tension. And I think it's clear from their interactions that if he survives, he's got more fuel to burn to get away from that. I mean, he's going to have a messed up life because you don't live through those circumstances at that time without sublimating it in a very destructive way. And we know from O'Neill's life that that wasn't without complication. But yeah, you're invested, and he's written it knowing that the end of the trail is 3 Pulitzers and a Nobel Prize for Literature. So you've kind of got that up your sleeve. See, that's one of the other reasons why I don't think he was writing it directly for immediate performance, is because you would do something else. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to write that character without some kind of qualification or negotiation with an audience. I think he's written a fairly accurate version of himself.
Yeah. And at that time, I don't think he believed he would be where he is now. And who would at that young age and where he'd got to? But you're absolutely right that he may physically leave, but he will never escape the family's emotional, psychological impact or ties. And he didn't. O'Neill didn't. He wrote it out of him all these years later in this play.
Yeah.
This is a slightly side note, but there is one more character in the play.
Yeah.
That of the Irish servant girl, Kathleen.
Yeah.
Who, given the intensity of the family quartet, is something of a surprise to see her come on stage, and maybe a welcome one. She's quite a lengthy scene with Mary, though she largely listens, of course, to her stories of the past. But why do you think O'Neill included her in the play?
To give us all a bit of a break.
Yeah.
To give us a bit of a laugh. I mean, mainly all of those reasons. I suppose it says quite a lot about how James Tyrone spends his money, that he won't pay for year-round staff of the highest level. He gets the seasonal staff, people that don't want to stay. So she brings in that idea that he's not investing in the home. But also dramaturgically, it's a way of hearing from Mary about the past. That scene at the top of Act 3 helps us catch up with Mary's sort of romantic view of the past because she's presenting it to Kathleen. So that's really helpful. And crucially, we get a witness to the interaction between Mary and getting the drugs.
Yeah.
Which cements that. So it's not about suspicion of Mary. We know because although Kathleen is disrespected by the rest of the characters, we've got no reason to mistrust her narration. So she gives us a kind of pivot point. And Louisa Harland plays it in our production, and she's absolutely brilliant. Very funny.
Very funny.
And when she comes on after having been given some whiskey, and the way she interacts with James Tyrone is just absolutely brilliant.
I think you're right. Just to be clear, she and Mary go to town in the car, and Kathleen is sent into the drugstore to collect a prescription. And the way she tells it, the chemist knows all too well what's going on with Mary's addiction.
Well, he's very suspicious of Kathleen and says to her, "Where did you get this?" about the prescription. And Kathleen points out to the car, and the pharmacist says, "Oh." And then he goes and gets the prescription and hands it over. It does tell us a whole story about how Mary is irregular.
Yes, exactly. But also, I think in general, she just provides a sort of connection to the outside world. She's relatively normal compared to the Tyrones and the traumas that we're witnessing. So you sort of get that perspective of what the community must make of what's going on.
Sure. I mean, you know, they were the Irish in that part of the United States that was sort of dominated by the Yankees. So, you know, to a degree, they were second-class citizens in a sense, but Tyrone and also James O'Neill had made a lot of money, which put them in a slightly different, less clear social position, which isolated them in that community probably.
Yeah, well, there's quite a lot, isn't there, from Mary about how isolated they are, that they aren't part of the community. She didn't want to be, it would seem, but it doesn't sound like they would have been very welcome either, in a way. So there is that background, you say. And I think I did read some of that where O'Neill had that sense when he was growing up about being Catholic Irish in the Yankee environment. This long night is wearing on, Jeremy.
Reminds me of a certain play.
Yeah, well, can we get to the last scene then of this certain play, which is, I think, one of the great scenes in world theater. O'Neill himself said, "I think that this is the greatest scene I've ever written," and it's hard not to agree. I just want to paint a little picture for listeners. The men are falling asleep in their chairs late at night here and have been waiting to make sure Mary is not awake upstairs because she may be prowling about and taking more of her drug. when we hear from offstage the piano being played. It sounds like a schoolgirl practicing, for it is Mary trying to rediscover the Chopin she used to play when she was a girl. And then she enters, wearing her dressing gown, her white hair down, as you said, Jeremy, and she's carrying her old wedding dress, which trails along the floor. Now, we've heard her refer to the wedding dress before in the play, and much like Chekhov's famous gun, we may have expected it to appear, but when it does, it's still deeply shocking and terribly moving. It occurred to me that the entrance was like Lear appearing with Cordelia in his arms, a profoundly sorrowful image. The men stare wordlessly at her. She's in a trance-like state induced by the morphine. Jamie, ever the truthful one, says bitterly, ironically, the mad scene, enter Ophelia. Wow, what is it about this scene that makes it such a heart-stopping moment in the theater, Jeremy?
It's that thing, isn't it? It's David Mamet phrase, surprising inevitability. That you're surprised, but also you've been on a freight train heading towards that destination the whole evening. So it's kind of perfect. And to me, it feels like it, I don't know, you'll have noticed in the production that basically the schema builds to that moment so that we get darker and darker with less and less information until that moment where it's unnaturally bright. What I wanted to do is to reach into the kind of most stripped back, almost Beckettian sense of the human experience and the futility and the horror of what it's like to be alive, born astride a grave. You know, it's one of those moments where suddenly you see her madness and you see her addictive delusion and your heart goes out for all of them. They're all lost. They're all completely unqualified to deal with this moment. And actually good old Jamie steps up and provides real maturity in that moment and the courage to be observant of what's happening.
They're almost struck dumb, aren't they? It's one of the powers of the scene is how little they say. Although Jamie quotes a number of heartbreaking lines from Swinburne poem, which are again beautifully poetic and appropriate. Also, it's a tableau, isn't it, where they're just helpless watching her.
Yeah.
And she talks on about the past. Again, she's disappeared completely into her childhood before she even met James at the convent. And there's a sense now, isn't there, that she's gone forever. That unlike previous times, do you think there's no coming back now from this pattern for her? Doesn't it feel like that?
Well, it's the peak of her using. Presumably there's some sort of crash that she'll maybe sleep it off or it'll wear off. She'll get some level of withdrawal and then the whole thing will start again.
Yes.
So this is, James identifies it earlier in the day. This is what happens. She'll be like a ghost haunting the past. And that turns out to be true. I mean, it's incredibly exciting considering that we've been told that it's going to happen all night. You know, you think it's going to happen and then it happens. You know about the piano, you know about the wedding dress, you know about her state of mind, you know about the past. And yet when it comes, I suppose it's like death. When it comes, you realize that you're not ready. You knew it was going to happen, but you're really not ready. And I suppose he's writing on that level, you know, he's writing on that existential level on those big themes. And it's at that point that the play becomes metaphor as well as a portrait of his family.
Surprising inevitability, as you say, and it works. It's set up, but again, it's shocking. And we're all like the Tyrone men. We're just caught, frozen, watching, helpless as she does this. It's absolutely spine-tingling in the theater, really. And it will go on repeating, I guess, is what we think as well, sadly. It's interesting that because the family's completely fractured, I suppose, at this point, but also bound together by this terrible thing they share. And it will go on being bound, as I guess O'Neill was to his family history. And I also think, I know the play is long, but one of the successes is that, as you talked about at the beginning about this distillation, is it feels like we've lived through a longer journey than just this one day, doesn't it? That we've experienced these past lives of these characters somehow and how they brought them to this place and will continue from here on. How has he managed that just within the confines of this one play and day?
I mean, that's the big question. I think it's because he knew his material and he had to get it out of himself somehow. So it's got that kind of reek of authenticity.
Yeah. Jeremy, I think we've come far enough on our journey here tonight. Thank you. Before I let you go, there's a tradition of the podcast where I like to ask my guests to recommend another play that we might cover in the podcast, or even just a personal favorite of yours. And I know this is iniquitous to ask a director for a personal favorite. It may be the one you're about to do, but is there something you want to recommend to our listeners?
Well, I would recommend, I mean, I'm immersed in it at the moment, and it really is a very good play. People, Places and Things by Duncan Macmillan. For those of you out there that are interested in plays enough to listen this far, then I think you will find it a really rewarding experience. It's a wonderfully written play. I don't think there's an answer fat on it. It doesn't do what O'Neill does, which is enjoy its repetition and circuitous sense of repeated patterns, almost in a symphonic structure and organization. It's sharp, it moves with real momentum. There's a lot of excellent twists and turns, and it's an interesting companion piece to a play like Long Day's Journey, because it's subjected also addiction and family and how the past informs the present.
It's amazing fact that you've put these two one after the other. And you're right, such honesty in the play, as I remember. Devastating to watch because it is so honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful leading role, the role of Emma, played by Denise Gough, who I hope will be a really fantastic Mary Tyrone one day.
Good call. Thank you. Well, we'll look forward to that. And it'd be great if we could come back and talk about that one, but I won't hold you to that.
No, please do. I'd be happy to bang on about all the plays that I'm working on.
Oh, great. The perfect play podcast guest. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for your time tonight. Jeremy's wonderful production of Long Day's Journey into Night continues at the Wyndham's Theatre in London until the 8th of June. Don't miss it. As the curtain falls on Mary taking her leave from those that love her and the men facing their own bleak future, we can do no better than leave the last word to O'Neill, who said of the ending of the play, "At the final curtain, there they still are, trapped within each other by the past, each guilty and at the same time innocent, scorning, loving, pitying each other, understanding, and yet not understanding at all, forgiving, but still doomed never to be able to forget." As he says, he wrote the play with deep pity and understanding and forgiveness for all the four haunted Tyrones, himself and the ghosts of his own past. Thanks for listening. See you next time. There are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.